Before his high-profile wedding to the supposed crown jewel of the Carlson Empire, the most feared mafia boss in the city decided to subject his fiancée to a test that would either cement his trust or destroy his world. Stephen H. McGee pretended to board a private jet for Sicily to handle a family emergency. Instead, he retreated into the shadows of a secret tactical room hidden within the very walls of his own mansion. His goal was simple: to witness how Catherine treated his ailing mother, Maggie, when she thought the king had left his throne. What he saw through the lens of those hidden cameras left his blood running cold. But it was the bravery of a soft-spoken caregiver that would eventually spark a fire in Stephen's frozen heart. You will not believe the lengths a person will go to for greed, or for love. If this story grips you, hit that like button and share it with someone who values loyalty. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale of justice and betrayal. The tactical suite sat behind a reinforced false wall in the McGee Library, a room known only to Stephen and his most loyal enforcer. The sterile, flickering light from 8 high-definition monitors washed over Stephen's face, highlighting the silver at his temples and the dangerous glint in his eyes. This room was designed to monitor cartels and track federal agents, but today, Stephen was hunting a predator inside his own home. He couldn't shake the memory of his mother's frail voice from 2 nights ago. Maggie had gripped his wrist, her voice a ghost of its former strength, and whispered, "Stephen, a snake can wear silk, but it still has fangs. Watch her when the room is empty, my son. That is when you will see her soul." He had wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to believe Catherine was his sanctuary. But as he sat in the oppressive silence of the secret room, the truth was about to be televised. On the largest screen, the mansion's grand foyer came into focus. Stephen watched Catherine standing by the mahogany doors, her hand pressed to her heart as she watched his motorcade depart. She looked like a grieving widow, her lips moving with silent promises of "I'll be waiting for you." The heavy doors clicked shut. In that heartbeat, Stephen felt a piece of his soul wither. The warmth in Catherine's eyes died instantly. The graceful, loving posture she had maintained for a year collapsed into a sharp, predatory stance. She didn't head to Maggie's room to comfort her. Instead, she pulled a secondary, encrypted phone from her vanity and tapped the screen with manic energy. Stephen dialed up the sensitive audio. Her voice, once like honey, now sounded like gravel. "The fool is gone. The sky is clear. Get over here now. We have a lot of paperwork to move before he gets back from the dead in Sicily." Stephen didn't roar. He didn't rush out to confront her. He sat as still as a gargoyle, his fingers steepled. In the world of the McGee family, a man who acts on emotion loses his head. A man who acts on evidence wins the war. 30 minutes of agonizing silence passed. Then, a silver Porsche, the very car Stephen had gifted his lead finance manager, Robert, for exceptional loyalty, pulled into the private driveway. Robert stepped out, adjusting his tie with a smirk of triumph, and entered the house using a key Stephen didn't know he had. The game wasn't just betrayal, it was a coup. And Stephen was watching every second of it. The heavy mahogany door of the McGee mansion had barely clicked shut behind Stephen's departure when the atmosphere inside the grand foyer underwent a chilling transformation. From his cramped sanctuary behind the library's false wall, Stephen H. McGee sat in a silence so absolute he could hear the frantic thrumming of his own pulse. 6 high-definition monitors bathed his sharp, weathered features in a ghostly pallor, revealing a world that was supposed to be his sanctuary but was rapidly proving to be a viper's nest. He watched the main screen, where Catherine B. Carlson, the woman he had planned to place at the head of the McGee empire, stood alone in the hall. The transition was instantaneous and sickening. The tears she had shed only moments ago as she kissed him goodbye dried as if by a heat lamp, replaced by a terrifying, hollow stillness. She didn't head to the chapel to pray for a safe return. Instead, she walked to the antique sideboard, poured a glass of his most expensive cognac, and took a slow, celebratory sip with a smirk that looked like a scar across her beautiful face. The escalation began with a single phone call. Stephen adjusted the audio frequency, his knuckles whitening as Catherine's voice filled the hidden room. It wasn't a melodic, soft tone she used to lull him into security. It was a jagged, predatory rasp. "The king is off the board," she whispered into her burner phone, her eyes darting toward the stairs leading to his mother's medical suite with pure loathing. He fell for the Sicily bait. "Tell the lawyers to move the offshore signatures to the first phase. And bring the car. I want to celebrate in his bed before the body is even cold." Stephen felt a surge of lethal adrenaline, but he forced himself to remain a ghost. He was a man who had built an underworld throne on patience, but seeing his fiancée mock his mother's illness by making a crazy gesture toward the upstairs monitors pushed him toward a breaking point he hadn't reached in decades. The stakes spiked to a fever pitch 20 minutes later when a familiar silver Porsche tore up the private drive, scattering gravel against the manicured hedges. Stephen leaned in, his eyes narrowing into slits as Robert, his hand-picked finance manager and the man who held the keys to the McGee coffers, stepped out of the vehicle. Robert didn't knock. He used a private bypass key, one Stephen had never authorized, and swept Catherine into a vulgar, triumphant embrace right in the center of the foyer. As they began to laugh, mocking Stephen's Mafia ego, and detailing how they had already siphoned 40% of the family's liquid assets, a small, flickering movement on the secondary monitor caught Stephen's eye. It was the camera inside his mother's darkened bedroom. Maggie, frail and hooked to an oxygen concentrator, had sat up, her eyes wide with a sudden, panicked lucidity as she heard the celebratory shouting from downstairs. At that moment, Catherine broke away from Robert, her face twisting into a mask of pure malice. "Wait here, darling," she hissed to the traitorous manager. "I need to go silence that old hag once and for all so we can finish the transfer in peace." Stephen watched in horror as Catherine grabbed a heavy silk pillow from the sofa and began to ascend the stairs with a slow, deliberate stride, her shadow stretching long and monstrous against the wall, leaving Stephen frozen in a silent scream of rage as the screen stayed locked on his mother's defenseless, trembling form. The silent sanctuary of the hidden room felt like a pressurized chamber as Stephen watched Catherine's shadow ascend the grand staircase. His hand hovered over the emergency release lever, every instinct screaming at him to burst through the library wall and wrap his fingers around her throat before she reached his mother's door. But just as Catherine reached the landing, a small, weary figure emerged from the service corridor. It was Eve Harper. She looked exhausted, her simple caregiver's uniform wrinkled from a double shift, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped directly into Catherine's path, her eyes landing on the heavy silk pillow gripped in the fiancé's hand. "What are you doing up here, Miss Carlson?" Eve's voice was soft but carried a steel edge that stopped Catherine in her tracks. The escalation was immediate. Catherine didn't offer an excuse. She sneered, her face contorting into a mask of aristocratic disgust. "Move aside, you pathetic charity case," Catherine hissed, stepping closer until she was inches from Eve's face. "I am the future mistress of this house. If I want to go in there and comfort my future mother-in-law, you have no right to stop me." Behind the wall, Stephen watched the monitor with bated breath. He saw Catherine hide the pillow behind her back, but Eve didn't blink. She remained a human shield in front of Maggie's door. "Mrs. McGee is sleeping," Eve stated firmly, despite the visible tremor in her hands. "And the doctor specifically ordered no visitors after 10. Please go back downstairs." Catherine's eyes flashed with a lethal, narcissistic rage. She reached out and gripped Eve's chin, digging her manicured nails into the girl's skin. "You think you're protecting her? You're just a cockroach I haven't stepped on yet. I know about your brother, Eve. I know he needs a kidney. One word from me to Stephen's finance team, and his name drops to the bottom of every donor list in the state. Now move." The cruelty of the threat sent a chill through Stephen that no underworld war ever had. He watched Eve's face crumble for a split second before she straightened her spine, her eyes welling with tears, but her feet remaining planted. "You can destroy me," Eve whispered, "but you won't touch her while I'm breathing." Downstairs, the stakes shifted again. Robert, the finance manager, was no longer celebrating. He was hunched over a laptop in the grand hall, his face pale in the screen's glow. "Catherine," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Get down here. Something's wrong." Catherine threw Eve aside with a violent shove and sprinted back to the railing. Stephen watched as Robert pointed frantically at the screen. "The offshore accounts, they're locking down. A secondary encryption just kicked in. It's a dead man switch. It means Stephen, he's not in Sicily." A deafening silence fell over the mansion. Catherine and Robert stood frozen, staring at the darkened library door at the end of the hall. In the secret room, Stephen stood up, the pale blue light of the monitors casting him as a vengeful shadow. He reached for the heavy brass handle of the false wall, but as he did, he saw one final image on the screen that stopped his heart. Catherine was reaching into the waistband of Robert's trousers, pulling out a silenced pistol and pointing it directly at the library door. "If he's in there," she growled, her voice devoid of any humanity, "he's not coming out alive." Stephen's hand gripped the lever, knowing that the moment he stepped out, he would be walking directly into a waiting bullet. The tension in the secret room was thick enough to choke as Stephen watched Catherine level the pistol at the very wall he stood behind. Every breath he took felt like a betrayal of the silence. On the monitor, Robert's face was a map of terror, his hands trembling as he hovered over the laptop. "If that dead man switch is active, Stephen's security team will be here in minutes," Robert hissed, his voice cracking. "We have to go, Catherine. Forget the mother. Forget the house. We have the first 20 million. But Catherine didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the library door with a predatory focus that made Stephen realize he had never known this woman at all. "I'm not leaving until I know he's dead," she spat, her finger tightening on the trigger. "If he's in that room, he's seen everything. He's a McGee, he won't just let us walk. We finish this now." The escalation reached a fever pitch as she began to walk toward the library, each step echoing like a funeral drum. Upstairs, the secondary monitor showed a different kind of horror. Eve, having heard the shouting and the mention of a gun, was frantically trying to barricade Maggie's door with a heavy dresser, her face streaked with tears as she whispered prayers for a man she thought was thousands of miles away. Suddenly, the library's internal phone rang. The sound was deafening in the quiet mansion. Catherine froze, her weapon wavering. On his screen, Stephen saw the caller ID. It was his head of security, Marcus, calling from the perimeter. But before Stephen could react, a loud, metallic clack echoed through the house. The power grid for the mansion flickered and died, plunged into darkness as the dead man's switch triggered the emergency lockdown. Red auxiliary lights bathed the halls in a blood-colored glow, turning the foyer into a scene from a nightmare. "Robert! The doors!" Catherine screamed as the heavy steel shutters began to hiss shut over every window and exit. They were trapped inside with the man they had just tried to ruin. In the red-tinted darkness of the secret room, Stephen finally gripped the manual override lever. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted them to feel the weight of the empire they had tried to steal. He threw the lever, and the false library wall began to grind open with a low, ominous rumble. Catherine whirled around, the red light glinting off the barrel of her gun. "Stephen," she called out, her voice trembling between a plea and a threat. As the wall slid back, revealing the towering, silhouetted figure of the Mafia boss, the monitor in the corner captured one last terrifying detail. Robert wasn't looking at Stephen. He was looking at the laptop, where a new notification had just popped up. The Serena Miller identity hadn't just been flagged by Stephen. It had been flagged by an Interpol red notice for the murder of 3 previous husbands. Just as Stephen stepped into the light, a heavy, thunderous boom shook the front of the mansion. The security team wasn't just coming, they were breaching the house with explosives, and in the chaos, Catherine's finger flinched on the trigger, the muzzle flash illuminating the room just as the first lead bullet tore through the air towards Stephen's chest. The roar of the breaching charges detonating at the mansion's front gates coincided perfectly with the deafening crack of Catherine's pistol. Stephen felt the wind of the bullet as it grazed his shoulder, thudding into the high-tech server rack behind him in a spray of sparks. He didn't flinch. The red emergency lights cast long, demonic shadows across the library as he stepped fully into the room, his presence alone seemingly sucking the oxygen out of the air. Catherine's face was a distorted mask of panic, her refined Carlson heritage falling away to reveal the desperate, cornered predator beneath. She went to fire a second shot, but the library's heavy oak doors were suddenly kicked inward with such force they splintered off their hinges. Marcus and a squad of tactical enforcers flooded the room, their laser sights painting Catherine's chest in a dozen lethal reds. "Drop it, Serena." Stephen's voice was a low, vibrational growl that seemed to shake the floorboards. The use of her real name acted like a physical blow. She froze, the gun trembling in her hand. Beside her, Robert had collapsed to his knees, his hands behind his head, sobbing about how he was forced into the scheme. Stephen ignored the coward, his gaze fixed entirely on the woman he had almost shared his life with. The real Catherine Carlson died in a fire in a Chicago slum 5 years ago. You've been living in a ghost's skin, feeding on my family like a parasite. The escalation reached a chilling peak as Stephen pulled a small remote from his pocket, clicking it to reveal the monitors he had been watching. The screens showed the hallway upstairs, where Eve was still standing guard, and the laptop on the desk detailing her murder warrants. "I saw what you did to my mother," Stephen whispered, his voice cracking with a rare, raw emotion. "I saw the pillow. I heard the threats against Eve's brother." Catherine realized the game was over, but instead of surrendering, she let out a jagged, manic laugh. "You think you've won because you have guns?" she sneered, her eyes darting to the tactical team. "I've already initiated the final transfer. In 60 seconds, the McGee Foundation's entire liquid wealth, money meant for your charities and your mother's care, will be encrypted and scattered across 100 untraceable accounts. If I don't enter the stop code, you're bankrupt by midnight." The stakes surged as the tactical team looked to Stephen for orders. The room was a powder keg of unresolved violence and financial ruin. Stephen took a slow, deliberate step toward her, ignoring the gun she still clutched. He wasn't looking at her face anymore. He was looking at the watch on his wrist. "You made one mistake, Serena," Stephen said, a predatory smirk finally touching his lips. "You assumed Robert was the only one who handled my finances." At that moment, the lights in the mansion flickered from red back to a steady, brilliant white. The lockdown shutters began to retract. On the laptop, the transfer progress bar suddenly turned a violent red and blinked with a single word: rejected. Upstairs, a scream pierced the air. It wasn't Maggie and it wasn't Eve. It was the sound of a secondary security team intercepting the cleaner Catherine had hidden in the attic. Catherine's bravado shattered. She lunged forward, not to shoot Stephen, but to dive for the laptop to delete the evidence of her past crimes. As she moved, Stephen grabbed her wrist in a grip of iron, twisting the weapon from her hand with a sickening pop of bone. He leaned into her ear, his voice a lethal promise. "You aren't going to jail, Serena. That would be too merciful for what you did to my mother." He signaled Marcus, who stepped forward with a set of heavy, non-standard restraints. "Take her to the basement. I want her to watch as I save every single person she tried to destroy." But as they dragged her away, a frantic Eve appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a medical tablet. "Stephen, it's Maggie." Her heart rate is skyrocketing. The stress of the breach. She's going into arrest. Stephen's triumph instantly turned to ash as he realized that while he had won the war, he might still lose the only person who truly loved him. The silence of the mansion was shattered by the frantic rhythm of Stephen's boots against the marble stairs. He ignored the captured traitors being dragged toward the darkness of the basement, his entire world narrowing down to the doorway of his mother's room. Inside, the scene was a chaotic blur of clinical white and emergency red. Maggie lay motionless, her face as pale as the silk sheets, while the heart monitor emitted a flat, terrifying drone that seemed to vibrate in Stephen's very bones. Eve was already on her knees beside the bed, her small hands locked together as she performed rhythmic chest compressions with a desperation that defied her exhaustion. "Move!" Stephen roared, but he didn't push Eve away. Instead, he dropped to the other side of the bed, his large, scarred hands trembling as he reached for the oxygen mask that had fallen to the floor. The escalation of the medical crisis was brutal. The private doctor was still minutes away, delayed by the very security breach Stephen had orchestrated. "Come back, Mom," Stephen whispered, his voice cracking, a sound that would have stunned his underworld rivals. "Don't leave me with them. Don't let them win." He watched Eve, her face drenched in sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she refused to stop. She was fighting for Maggie's life, as if it were her own mother on the line, her eyes fixed on the monitor with a ferocity that matched Stephen's own. Suddenly, the flat line on the monitor gave a jagged, uncertain hop. Then another. A weak, thready pulse began to register, and Maggie's chest gave a sudden, spasmodic heave. Eve collapsed back against the foot of the bed, her lungs burning, but she didn't stop to rest. She immediately grabbed a syringe of emergency medication from the bedside tray, medication Catherine had tried to withhold, and administered it with surgical precision. The stakes shifted from life and death to a fragile hope as Maggie's eyes fluttered open, clouding with confusion before settling on Stephen's face. "Stephen," she rasped, her voice a mere ghost. You stayed?" The emotional weight of the moment was broken by a sharp crackle on Stephen's radio. It was Marcus, calling from the lower levels. "Boss, we have a problem in the basement. Serena isn't talking, but we found her secondary device. She didn't just target your bank accounts. She sent an encrypted kill signal to a local crew, the Valeni family. They think you're in Sicily, and the house is unprotected. They're 3 minutes out, and they aren't coming for the money. They're coming to burn the mansion to the ground with everyone inside to erase the McGee bloodline." Stephen looked at his frail mother, then at Eve, who was still clutching Maggie's hand, offering the only comfort she had left. He realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity that the war wasn't over. It had moved to his front doorstep. He stood up, the vulnerability of the sun vanishing as the iron-willed boss returned. He turned to Eve, his gaze intense. "Take her to the safe room behind the armory. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Marcus. If I don't come back, there's a folder in the floorboard. It has everything you need to save your brother." Eve looked at him, the terror in her eyes replaced by a sudden, fierce loyalty. "You come back, Stephen," she said, her voice steady. "She needs her son." As Stephen stepped into the hallway, the sound of heavy tires screeching on the driveway echoed through the house, followed by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of automatic fire hitting the reinforced front doors. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a fortress under siege, and Stephen was the only thing standing between the women he cared for and total annihilation. The sound of automatic gunfire shredding the grand foyer's oak panels was a declaration of total war. Stephen didn't hesitate. He grabbed a tactical vest and a customized assault rifle from a hidden rack in the hallway, his movements fluid and precise, the muscle memory of a man born in the trenches of the underworld. "Marcus, execute defensive pattern Delta," he barked into his comms. "Kill the lights and activate the internal traps. I want these bastards to feel like they've walked into a graveyard." Below him, the Valeni soldiers breached the foyer, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like frantic needles. They were confident, expecting an empty house or a few panicked guards. They didn't know the king was home. The escalation was a symphony of chaos. As the first 3 Valeni hitmen crossed the threshold, the floorboards beneath them gave way, a trapdoor leading to a holding cell in the sub-basement. Their screams were cut short by the heavy thud of the steel floor resetting. Stephen watched from the shadows of the upper mezzanine, his pulse steady, his gaze locked on the leader of the hit squad, a man he recognized as Rico Valenti, the hot-headed youngest brother of his main rival. Stephen didn't just want to stop them. He wanted to send a message that would resonate through every crime family in the country. He dropped a smoke grenade into the foyer, and as the thick, gray mist swallowed the invaders, he descended the stairs like a vengeful spirit. The stakes became personal when a stray bullet from Rico's wild firing shattered the glass of a family portrait hanging near the safe room. Stephen's rage boiled over. He moved through the smoke with terrifying speed, neutralizing 2 gunmen with silent, lethal efficiency before stepping directly into Rico's line of sight. You chose the wrong house to burn, Rico. Stephen's voice boomed through the mist, sounding more like a judgment than a warning. Rico spun around, his eyes wide with the realization that he had been set up. "McGee? You're supposed to be in Sicily," he stammered, raising his weapon, but Stephen was faster. A single, well-placed shot disabled Rico's arm, sending his rifle clattering to the marble floor. Suddenly, the intercom system crackled to life. It wasn't Marcus. It was Serena's voice, echoing from the basement level where she had somehow managed to get to a secondary terminal. "Stephen," she shrieked, her voice manic and full of spite. "You think you're the only one who plays with fire? I've overridden the mansion's gas lines. If you don't let me and Robert walk out that front door in the next 60 seconds, I'll turn this entire estate into a funeral pyre. Your mother, your precious little maid, and your empire. All of it becomes ash." The air in the foyer suddenly grew heavy with a sharp, sweet scent of natural gas. The Valenti soldiers, sensing the impending explosion, began to retreat in a panic, but the lockdown shutters were jammed by Serena's override. Everyone was trapped in a ticking time bomb. Stephen looked toward the safe room where Eve and his mother were huddled, then back toward the stairs leading to the basement. He had a choice: finish the fight with Rico or dive into the heart of the mansion to stop the woman who was determined to be his end. Just as he turned to run toward the gas valves, a massive explosion rocked the rear of the house, and the monitors in his tactical earpiece went static, leaving him in total darkness as the sound of rushing flames began to roar from the kitchen. The roar of the fire in the kitchen was a hungry beast, clawing its way through the ventilation shafts. Stephen sprinted through the smoke-filled corridors, his lungs burning as the scent of gas became a physical weight. He reached the basement stairs just as the emergency lights flickered one last time and died, leaving him in a world of orange flickers and dancing shadows. In the sub-basement, he found Serena standing over the main gas manifold, a flare gun in her hand, and a look of pure, unadulterated madness in her eyes. Robert was gone. The coward had likely perished in the initial blast or fled into the crawlspaces, but Serena remained, the queen of a burning castle. "One step closer, Stephen, and we all go up together," she screamed over the sound of the rushing gas. Stephen didn't stop. He didn't plead. He moved with the cold, calculated precision of a man who had already accepted his death. "You think I'm afraid to die with you?" Stephen's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that cut through the hiss of the gas. "I've survived 3 wars and a dozen hits. But you're afraid of being nothing. You're afraid of going back to that gutter in Chicago where you started." The psychological blow landed harder than a bullet. Serena's hand trembled, the flare gun wavering. In that split second of hesitation, Stephen lunged, not for her, but for the emergency shut-off valve. He wrenched the iron wheel with a scream of exertion, the metal groaning as it sealed the flow just as Serena pulled the trigger. The flare streaked past his head, hitting a pile of dry crates and erupting into a localized fireball, but the explosion that would have leveled the mansion was averted. He didn't wait to see her reaction. He tackled her to the ground, securing her wrists with a jagged piece of zip tie from his tactical vest. "Marcus. The safe room. Get them out now," he roared into his radio, but all he got back was static. Heart hammering, Stephen fought his way back up the stairs, the heat now so intense it blistered the paint on the walls. He reached the safe room behind the armory and threw his shoulder against the reinforced door. It was jammed from the outside by fallen debris. With a roar of primal strength, he cleared the rubble and burst inside. He found Eve slumped over Maggie, using her own body to shield the elderly woman from the thick black smoke rolling in under the door. Stephen scooped his mother into his arms and grabbed Eve by the waist, hauling them toward the library's hidden exit. They emerged into the cool night air just as the fire department's sirens began to wail in the distance. He laid his mother on the grass, where Marcus and the surviving security team immediately swarmed to provide medical aid. Stephen stood up, his face blackened by soot, his clothes scorched, and looked at Eve. She was coughing, her hands burnt from the dresser she had moved, but she was alive. At that moment, the sun began to peek over the horizon, illuminating the ruins of the McGee mansion. 3 months later, The headlines about the Carlson heiress fraud had faded, replaced by news of the most unexpected wedding in the city's history. Stephen H. McGee stood at the altar of a small, private chapel, his mother sitting in the front row, looking healthier than she had in years thanks to a successful surgery funded by the McGee estate. Beside her sat a young man, Eve's brother, whose new kidney had been secured by Stephen's personal medical team. As the doors opened, Eve Harper walked down the aisle, not in a maid's uniform, but in a dress of pure white silk. Stephen didn't see a caregiver or a victim. He saw the only person who had ever been loyal to him for nothing in return. But as the priest began the ceremony, Stephen's lead enforcer slipped a note into his hand. Stephen opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read the single line, "Serena Miller has escaped from the high-security transport." Stephen looked at his beautiful bride, then at the shadow of a man standing at the back of the chapel who didn't belong. The war wasn't over. It was just moving into the light. Thank you for watching these intrigues on our channel. For more, please subscribe by clicking on the bell button.